Hello, my name's John Collick and I'm Head of International Education Strategy at Promethean. Over the next half hour, I want to talk a little bit about education technology strategies for a changing world. Now, I'm going to look at how the events of the last 2 years are going to impact on the development of education technology, but also consider important trends that were already emerging that will impact on what we do as teachers and learners. Now, the current crisis has forced us to radically rethink a lot of our teaching and learning priorities on a global level. From the long term, I think it will certainly have a strong influence on the development of pedagogy. And it will also increase the need for innovation in education. We also need to think very carefully about the skills and the support that students and teachers will need moving forwards. Now, this situation is certainly challenging a lot of our assumptions about the role of technology. And in general, I think there's going to be a permanent shift in our approach to access, to teaching, to well-being and mental health, to assessment, and also monitoring and governance. These are kind of the big ticket items that ministries of education that I talk to all over the world are thinking about at the moment. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, because many of these changes will in fact offer us real opportunities. So I want to take as a starting point the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, particularly number 4, which is all about providing quality education. Now, as you can see from this extract, one of the main emphases of the SDGs for education is equal access. Basically, education must be for everybody, including people in poor, marginalised or vulnerable groups. Historically, we think of technology as being the great enabler for education, particularly in a situation like we have now, where many governments have shifted to various forms of online learning. Now, the idea, at least until recent events, was that through online learning and distance learning, technology would provide rich learning content and resources and lessons for students studying from home. In many ways, it's a very futuristic vision. This is a perfect example for a vision of education online. You have this boy sitting here. He's got his VR headset. He's studying science. It's a very, very powerful dream. But it's also very utopian. And as we have seen over the last 2 years, the reality is actually quite different. Some of you may have already seen this photograph. It's taken from security camera footage on a building site in Peru. The guards noticed that night after night, this boy was coming to the building site and sitting under the spotlights. When they investigated it and asked him what he was doing, he told them he was doing his homework because at home he had no electricity, and as soon as the sun went down, he couldn't study anymore. And this is a good example of how a lot of assumptions are based around technology and education are really being thrown into question. The COVID-19 crisis has really brought out the issue of power and connectivity. As governments scramble to get students and teachers online, they faced significant problems. Globally, only 14% of the world's population have access to broadband, and only about 44% have access to any kind of internet whatsoever. You also have approximately 1 billion people living without access to stable electricity supplies. Now, obviously, access in a city and amongst the affluent and the rich is easier, and the people who tend not to have access tend to be the poor and those living in remote and marginalised communities. Now, another interesting statistic is that mobile coverage is much, much greater. Globally, 101% of the world's population have access to some kind of mobile device. There are more mobile phones than there are people, and in certain countries this figure is much larger. In certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa, mobile usage can hit levels of 130 to 140%. They're not all got iPhones, but mobile is definitely, for the vast majority of the world's population, it's the biggest point of contact between them and the technology and any possible technology or online delivery of education. Now, in the immediate response to COVID-19, governments and education systems reacted by moving in two different directions. In the wealthier countries that had a stable infrastructure already there, they moved to online learning with varying degrees of success. In the countries that didn't have an adequate infrastructure, they moved more towards broadcast education using TV and radio. This had an immediate impact on approaches to teaching and pedagogy. Broadcast and TV radio obviously reaches far more people than going online. The problem is that broadcast-based education consists of teachers lecturing students. It's very teacher-centred and inflexible, but it has the advantage that almost everybody can benefit. In the case of online education, the pedagogy moves towards project-based learning, child-centred learning. It's more flexible because you have a range of different formats, but again, it's for the privileged few. And even in wealthy households, they may only have one computer. If you have more than one child at different stages in education, then it's going to be difficult for them because they're all going to be competing for time to do their homework and their studying. This is another reason why mobile learning offers a more equitable solution going forward. Now, in the longer term, we're likely to see education systems moving back and forth along a continuum, what we call a hybrid learning continuum. And if you think of this as 100% home learning at one end and 100% classroom teaching at the other, hybrid learning allows education to occur at any point along that continuum, depending on what the circumstances are. So, for example, you may have 50% of the kids in class and 50% of the kids from that class at home, and they may be studying the same materials. They may be doing it synchronously, but more likely they're going to be doing it asynchronously, watching recordings or taking part in some kind of flipped classroom activities. Now, to make sure that hybrid learning works effectively, it's important that we implement an approach to education that provides students with the skills they need to become self-aware and self-managing learners. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a short while, but we also need to make absolutely sure that any online learning method comes with a community, to maintain the social aspect of education as much as possible, and also we also need to make sure that teachers get the support they need to work within this paradigm. Now, we're all aware that there is a downside to the shift to online learning. It will move and it will accelerate this shift towards child-centred and self-aware learning, but there are challenges. From a teacher's point of view, it's been compounded by an increase in workload, by accompanying fatigue and burnout. Teachers all over the world have done an absolutely fantastic job in very challenging circumstances, and they are the real heroes of the hour, but it hasn't come without a cost. And we need to make sure, therefore, that any hybrid online or distance learning, as I said before, has a strong community focus and is not just about delivering content and lessons. So as I said, by its very nature, distance learning tends to be student-centred and project-based. If you think that when a child is at school, they will go to classes pretty much continually with a teacher teaching them for more or less 100% contact time. This is simply not practical in a distance learning environment. You don't want a child sitting in front of a screen for hour after hour after hour, lesson after lesson after lesson. So what is tended to happen is that teachers give students project work or complex tasks to do by themselves. Students go away, they do the tasks, they then submit them, they upload them as the report or evidence for assessment. It does demand a large amount of self-management, and so we need to be teaching children how to manage their own time, how to manage their own motivation, how to organise themselves as independent learners. So what specific skills are we talking about? We need to develop students who are self-aware, students who are empowered to take direction of their own learning and become self-directed learners rather than the objects of data systems. One approach is to encourage them to understand and articulate the process through which they learn. Another is to focus on analysis and critical thinking skills. For example, the ability to seek out and identify valid resources and material and content that is robust, legitimate, and useful. Another crucial skill, and this is particularly important, is emotional intelligence. This has a particular resonance in the current situation, which has proved extremely challenging for both mental health and well-being. As I said, teachers all over the world have really risen to the challenges and achieved fantastic results, but it has come at a cost. It's come at a cost in terms of well-being and health for teachers, students and parents. And one good thing actually to come out of this is that we are now seeing a global recognition of the absolute paramount importance of well-being and mental health for all of those who are involved in education. Now, later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which teachers can be supported by colleagues in this situation, particularly through the development of organic communities. And that kind of brings me on to one of my main points in this presentation. Education is a social activity. We have always tended to focus on the transfer of knowledge and skills as being the core of teaching and learning, but just as important, if not more important, is this concept of education as a socialization process. By learning in groups with other children, we come to understand the basic principles of citizenship, of emotional intelligence, of cooperation, ethics, health, well-being, etc. There's been some very interesting studies being done on this by the OECD, particularly on the early learning and its impact on social outcomes. But at a very basic level, we learn better when we're in a group, face-to-face, with other children. When we are by ourselves, the isolation leads to motivation issues and it becomes a struggle. So, in implementing any kind of system to facilitate learning during and post the pandemic, we need to develop ways of creating some kind of community that will compensate for the loss of socialization. It will never compensate for the actual lived real experience of being with other people in a teaching and learning situation. However, online learning management systems should not be just for teaching and assessment. They must also incorporate functionality that allows for support, sharing, and communication. Now, we have seen the implementation of a lot of top-down learning management systems, and they are useful for administration and oversight. But a community that has a structure and an organization that is imposed from above is far less powerful than an organic support network that develops from the ground up, not least because people will feel more personally invested in a system that they have helped to create themselves. From a teacher's point of view, organic networks are essential for promoting well-being by providing the opportunity to socialize within a supportive community. They also provide a route for training and support with technology and the opportunity for professionals to share and collaborate on resource development. Now, the problem is, of course, as I said before, complex online platforms initiated from above with strict hierarchies and reporting mechanisms can actually be a little bit counterproductive. Participants may feel constrained by the system, they may feel uncomfortable in a hierarchical structure about opening up about their concerns or their worries. It also demands our time. To be perfectly honest, after 2 years we are all zoomed out, so yet more online meetings can often add to the stress. That's why simple texting can provide a quick and easy route to building up an organic community without the need for teachers to learn yet another online platform or spend significant time engaging with it. Texting to colleagues in a group can take a few minutes, but it can be very, very rewarding. One model that works extremely well in a text environment is the daily morning meeting. Now, this is a technique used by Japanese companies, and it involves everybody getting together every morning for a brief meeting. Every person says what they're doing that day, they voice any questions or concerns. Everybody might sing the company song, you don't have to do that. But this is an excellent way for people to share their experiences and get an understanding of what their colleagues are currently working on. It's really, really effective idea. Now, what you can do is you can take this, in Japan, rather formal scenario, and you can set up a daily morning meeting on a texting group. Quick, very informal. As I said before, it only takes a few moments to take part, and it provides a quick and easy communication channel without the need to log on to complex systems or to take part in video conferencing. Everybody can just text, what are you doing today? You know, I'm trying this, I'm doing this, I had this problem with this student, I'm feeling a bit stressed. You know, it's very easy and very quick to take part in this, but it's also very valuable. And of course, it's, as I said before, it's very important for well-being that people feel free to express their feelings, their worries, their concerns. And this, in the context of texting, can be done extremely easily using emojis. You don't have to go type up a long explanation of how you're feeling. You can just bang in some emojis. And it's a good way of expressing emotions, feelings, concerns or worries without having to go into too much kind of detail. But it also allows you to initiate that discussion. Now, I'm not saying that groups like this shouldn't be moderated, but moderation should be non-judgmental. It should be entirely process and rules based rather than, judgmental, going in and not criticizing or commenting on what people are saying, because that will introduce constraints. Okay, so that's talking a little bit about organic communities. I now want to go back to some of the ways in which education has tried to be facilitated online over the last couple of years. And I particularly want to talk about issues to do with what I call canned education. Because of the sudden need for distance learning content, we've seen a big upsurge in programs, courses and apps that are designed to teach kids using games or game-based approaches, very flashy, very kind of bright and coloured cartoon animals and characters, etc. Many of these are indeed useful, but there are a number of issues around this canned education, which mean it's not really a proper substitute for the kind of human interaction that I've been talking about. To begin with, children aren't daft. Education games always suffer from what I call the chocolate-coated broccoli syndrome. The idea that by taking a subject and presenting it with brightly coloured cartoons or simple arcade-style games, it's instantly going to become that much more motivating. You're trying to disguise something that children may be reluctant to engage with, but you're not fooling anyone. And the other issue that we have, particularly when children are learning remotely, is distraction. Why would a child be motivated to play an education game when with a couple of clicks of the mouse they can go and play Fortnite or they can go and play the latest version of Final Fantasy? The other thing also, as I said this before, there is a more fundamental issue here. We've got screens and games and programs and databases coming out of our ears. And we're even starting to get sick of computer games. Because what we miss is real people. We miss interaction with human beings. So effective online learning has to somehow provide, even in a small degree, some kind of proxy for that. This is why the idea of familiarity and authenticity is so important. Even when teaching is delivered online, it's better if it's done by a teacher the pupils know personally and that they can see during the session. Streaming a lesson delivered by somebody they know, they recognise, that's in a familiar classroom, their classroom, even if that classroom is empty apart from the teacher and the active panel, it's much more effective and much more engaging than the most sophisticated or interactive online education platform. These sophisticated canned education programs might be entertaining, they might be motivating if you can access it, if you've got the broadband to do that, but it's also impersonal. And at the end of the day, as I said, what we miss is engagement with real people, people we know. Now, the good news is that the familiarity and authenticity approach also comes with the added bonus of not requiring professional production values. In fact, something that's too polished, too flawless, can also come across as canned. It comes across as a little bit unreal. Instead, teachers should forget the felt need to create something that's perfect, the perfect online multimedia experience. Amateur production, your little grainy QuickTime movie or YouTube streaming video, it's far more genuine, and it gives a far more human quality to the delivery, especially again when it's created and presented by somebody the students recognise, their own teacher. It's also important to remember that the online delivery of teaching and learning works best in small doses. The latest discoveries in neuroscience suggest that the window for effective cognition, for effective learning, is about 5 to 7 minutes long, and really should contain a maximum of 3 concepts. So any videos or learning chunks should fit this time constraint wherever possible, particularly during lockdown. What we do know is the stress caused by isolation has also impacted on our ability to concentrate and to learn for long periods of time. And that brings me on to this notion of learning loss, just to finish up with. As we move in and out of lockdown, we are seeing globally more and more evidence of massive attainment gaps when children return to the classroom. Those children who had access to the internet and a quiet place to study and were encouraged to do so, more or less managed to learn. They managed to still learn. The students that did not have access, didn't have a quiet place, or for whatever reason were unable to study, they fall behind and they have suffered from significant loss of learning. The first big challenge for educators when we get back to some semblance of normality is to determine this loss of learning and to develop methods of differentiation to make sure that the children who have been left behind can quickly catch up with their friends. There are a number of simple techniques that can allow this. One technique that can be used individually or on a whole class basis is knowledge or mind mapping, whereby the students and the teachers map out all of the themes and topics of a particular subject and then use this to tick off or to map areas that are less well understood, that need review or are missing. As I said, this can be a whole class activity on the active panel, for example, or it can be individual project work in class or at home. When done individually, it also encourages students to become more self-aware and self-managing learners. So in summary, the last 2 years have seen significant challenges for teachers and students around the world, and have also led us to reassess our education priorities from a strategic level all the way down into the classroom. Most governments and educators now recognise that the number one priority has to be the mental health and well-being of teachers and pupils. In addition, it's clear that lesson delivery, online lesson delivery, that incorporates familiarity and authenticity rather than sophisticated high-end interactive canned education is much, much more effective. Organic communities based on simple texting are an excellent way of providing support for teachers. And finally, the acceleration towards student-centered learning means that the need to provide young people with the skills and competencies to be self-managing and self-aware learners is increasingly important. So, thank you very much. I hope this has been interesting. I hope it's been useful. Please, there's my email address. Please, if you have any comments or you have any questions or would like to get in touch with me, please don't hesitate to drop me a message. So thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.